you very much, Michael. Yes, indeed, I'm sure you're going to learn something today, either about Antony and Cleopatra or what not to do when giving a lecture at a basic program weekend. As some of you know, my thinking has evolved over the course of this weekend, and I have found the conversations and the presentations to be very fruitful. And so what I'm going to actually be doing is kind of modifying, but also really extending what I had planned to talk about and going off in a new direction. So the original title for my work is A Triple Pillar of the World Transformed into a Strumpet's Fool, Duty and Desire in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. I won't tell you what the new title is until I get to the end, but it is a work in progress, and it's something that I'm actually working out for the first time here at this weekend, and I'm kind of excited about it, and I actually invite your help and suggestions when we get to the end. I need to say, of course, therefore, that gratitude is due to Mr. Bevington, to Claudia Trout, and to Joe Alulis, who I've gotten some very important ideas from, and the canons of scholarly ethics demand that I credit them, which I'm very happy to do. On the other hand, I'm quite willing to recognize, appreciate that they may not recognize their ideas when I have used them, nor may they wish to acknowledge the uses to which I've put them. Be that as it may. And I'm also grateful to you and to the BASIC program for actually having this kind of event that allows us to explore and be creative and thoughtful about classic works in a relaxed way. So, without further ado, what I am planning to do this morning is to talk about Antony and Cleopatra, and I'm going to do it kind of in 5 steps. The first one is I would just like to talk a little bit about an approach in terms of interpreting this work. We've talked a little bit, both in terms of the presentations and people's questions and answers, of to what degree is context relevant or going outside the 4 corners of the play, or if it's a poetic play, or all the rest of these kinds of issues. And I think from a principled point of view, that demands a certain consideration so that we can know what we're trying to do when we're going to do it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an approach to interpreting Antony and Cleopatra. With that in hand, I'm going to turn to the second section, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what Antony and Cleopatra is not. And I have several examples I'd like to show about what I think it is not. With that in hand, I'd like to turn to, first of all, what I think it is, kind of part 1, talking about it as a tragedy. But I'd also like to talk about, in a second part, what I think Antony and Cleopatra is, in some sense, as a comedy, and that it has both of these components. And then finally, I'll try to draw all these strands together in a conclusion and reveal the new title of the talk. So, in terms of taking an approach to Antony and Cleopatra, as we have discussed quite frequently, Shakespeare did not make this play up out of whole cloth. He is drawing on source material, in particular Plutarch's account of Antony. And as we've also heard many people mention, there are other accounts, both of Antony, the Battle of Actium, other kinds of history. And depending on what one is interested in, there are various ways of using Shakespeare's play. I mean, if you're actually interested in the real history of what occurred with the historical Mark Antony or the historical Cleopatra or the historical Battle of Actium and so on, actually it may turn out that Shakespeare's play is of little or no relevance or use. If you want to see what Shakespeare is doing with his source material, that's obviously of some use by comparing it with what he had to start with. But ultimately, I think in a BASIC program, our goal, or at least my understanding of our goal, is to try to understand a given text, in this case, the play Antony and Cleopatra as we have it. But I think thinking about this history shows us there's kind of 3 stages, at least, in this process that we might want to consider and keep in mind. One is that somewhere behind all of this, there were some events that apparently actually happened. There was a historical Antony and a historical Cleopatra and battles and so on. These events, not illusory. So there are the events themselves on the one hand. On the second hand, there are historical accounts of these events. Plutarch, for example, has written something about what he understood to have occurred, and his understanding may be accurate, it may be inaccurate, it may be biased with his perspective, but it's got what Plutarch thinks is important in Plutarch's account. And then ultimately we have Shakespeare's play, which is Shakespeare's, I don't know if you want to call it adaptation, but taking this source material, Plutarch in particular, and transforming it into the work that we have been studying and heard dramatically read portions of last night. And one of the questions that's arisen, and it does arise when we deal with plays that are based on source material, is, what exactly is the playwright doing? Is he or she really just simply repeating something that people have already known, or putting it on the stage? Or is the playwright transforming this source material in some way, or what is actually going on? And I think one of the things, without prejudging all the answers to these things, is that both in the writing of history and in the writing of a play based on the history, we're moving from some set of actual events to people's consideration of what happened, being able to actually articulate that and conceptualize what happened, and then ultimately, what does it mean that this happened? What is the meaning in these events? And I think that that's where Shakespeare, in a sense, is transforming the source material that he's got from Plutarch and actually drawing out new meaning from the events of Antony and Cleopatra, which may or may not have anything to do, ultimately, if we push all the way back to the actual historical facts that actually occurred, but nonetheless, it's what Shakespeare has made out of this. So looking what happened, what does it mean? The second thing in terms of an approach to a play like Antony and Cleopatra, I think, is to look at the technical characteristics of the text. We've talked, many people have spoken and in presentations and in the questions, talking about some of the technical features of this play. One of which is that it's almost like a kaleidoscope of scenes, okay? That we're giving kind of pell-mell of cuts from one place to another, so that, as I kind of likened it to, if you've ever watched these, TV shows like Hill Street Blues or something like that, where it's like the attention span of the audience is not longer than 3 minutes, and they have to keep cutting, like, meanwhile. There's a little bit of that in Antony and Cleopatra as a play. And one of the other consequences or corollaries of that is that the events, the historical events in the play are actually compressed in a timeline. It's not actually clear, I don't think, in the play how much elapsed time there is from the opening of Act 1 to the close of Act 5 within the play. And when we started talking about comparing Shakespeare to Plutarch and so on, and how many years Antony lived with Octavia in Athens and all these, you don't have any sense of that from the play. That it's actually, although if I could just caricature it a little bit, it may be that Antony and Cleopatra violates the unity of place, but it's almost as if it adheres to the unity of time, as if the whole thing had taken place in a day, although that obviously can't be the case, but it's kind of compressed in that sense. And whether that's good or bad, Shakespeare should or should not have done it, is kind of beside the point. That is the play that we have, and I think we need to acknowledge that when we're trying to interpret the play that we're given. So another feature from this kind of style, as many people have also observed, is that in some ways this play is very poetic. And I don't think that means, I don't want to speak for what anybody else is saying, but my understanding of talking about Antony and Cleopatra as a poetic play is not just that there's poetic language in it, which there certainly is, and is in many of Shakespeare's plays, but it's almost as if the play and these little scenes all juxtaposed is itself a poem of sorts, and that the scenes are almost like stanzas in some way, and that we are being given not an exposition, not a narrative, not a work of philosophy, not a treatise, but a poem of sorts. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us, I think, to try to interpret the work as a poem, with the standard techniques that we might bring to poetry, which means, for example, looking at the images that are employed, looking at the comparisons and contrasts that are deployed, looking at the sequence or progressions that are employed. And therefore, the play, just like a poem, for example, may never actually say in black and white what it is or what it means, but a good interpreter will be able to elicit from that a reading which can be articulated and which will correspond to what is in fact in the text. And that brings me kind of like to the last piece of talking about an approach, which is I don't know that in any play, I mean it could certainly be in some plays, but I don't know that it's necessary that in any play or any narrative or in any poem that the meaning, quote unquote, is going to be in the words of any particular character. Okay, it may not, I mean, sometimes I suppose there's a chorus which says what the playwright is thinking, or sometimes the hero says what the playwright is thinking, but it's not incumbent upon the playwright to put the actual words into any particular character's mouth. So I don't want to, we should be able to look at what the characters are saying and doing and how they're representing themselves and each other. But it may be that there's no smoking gun, in a sense, where we find a single line which is, aha, the magic bullet, this tells us what Antony and Cleopatra means as a play. Or I would also even like to kind of caution, in a sense, that similar to that it's not necessarily clear that the meaning of the play is going to be found in seeking the motivation or the psychology of any one or even all of the characters. I mean, what is driving Antony? What is driving Cleopatra? What is driving Caesar? I mean, these are important factors, but ultimately, even there, we may not find the meaning, as it were. And I guess what I'd like to offer instead of it is a sense of trying to understand what is kind of the value system that the play manifests, which may actually be different than the values of any of the characters. There's a famous literary interpretive scholar, Mikhail Bakhtin, who talks about the idea of there being a voicing in a text. And this is a metaphor from symphonic music, with this idea that there can be a voice in an orchestral piece, which is not necessarily a part that any particular instrument is playing or to be attributed to any particular instrument, but it is a voice that is carried out throughout the work. And to the extent that there are voicings within Antony and Cleopatra, and I think there are, that we can locate the meaning, such as it is, in the play. So, in terms of the approach, just to kind of review briefly, we're talking about the transformation of actual events into historical accounts, into a work of art, which brings up the question of, what happened and what does it mean, and that the meaning that Shakespeare draws from it may well be quite different than the meaning that Plutarch drew from it. The technical characteristics of a poem, of a kaleidoscope, et cetera, and kind of looking for the value system that is manifested in the play, whether or not any of the characters themselves consciously recognize this or articulate it even. And I'm not discounting they may, but it's not dependent upon that. So what I'd like to do next then is kind of offer a couple of several selections of what Antony and Cleopatra, I think, is not. By doing a brief Cook's tour of the classics in 30 seconds or less, because we talk about these great love stories or these great warriors or these great women of history, and I think in abstract that's fine, but it's also worth looking at how these women or men or these encounters have been portrayed in particular works of Western literature, or not even just Western literature. And, the starting place for everything has to be the Iliad, where we have Helen of Troy. And what I'd like to say, and I'm not going to summarize the Iliad for you. Presumably everybody here is familiar to some degree with the Iliad. But that Cleopatra is not Helen. Antony is neither Achilles, nor Paris, nor Menelaus. The encounter between Cleopatra and Antony is not the encounter between Helen and any of these people. And I would just like to offer one brief passage from the Iliad, just to offer some alternative of this. And this occurs when we're first introduced to Helen, or early in the book, in Book 3 of the Iliad. And I'm using the Knox translation here at line 178. And it's talking about the old men of Troy sitting on the wall. And it says, "The old men of the realm held seats above the gates. Long years had brought their fighting days to a halt. But they were eloquent speakers still, clear as cicadas, settled on treetops, lifting their voices through the forest, rising softly, falling, dying away. So they waited, the old chiefs of Troy, as they sat aloft the tower, and catching sight of Helen moving along the ramparts, they murmured one to another gentle, winged words. Who on earth could blame them? Ah, no wonder the men of Troy and Argives under arms have suffered years of agony, all for her, for such a woman. Beauty, terrible beauty, a deathless goddess, so she strikes our eyes. But still, ravishing as she is, let her go home in the long ships and not be left behind. For us and our children, down the years, an irresistible sorrow. And for me, this is, it's a beautiful vision of a magnificent woman. Everybody recognizes, A, that she's magnificent, and B, that any guy worth his salt, would be fighting for her. But at the end of the day, really, it's not worth it. And please, Helen, please, that's it. That'll be a new play of mine. Please, Helen, go home. So that's one image of what I think Antony and Cleopatra as individuals, as a relationship, and so on is not. A second instance of what Antony and Cleopatra are not comes from the, I won't say sequel, but the supposed successor to the Iliad, which is the Odyssey. And we have, in this case, there are many beautiful women, Calypso, Circe, Nausicaa, and so on. But the woman par excellence in the Odyssey is, of course, Penelope, Odysseus' wife. And this is not Antony and Cleopatra either, okay? And I think the place which expresses best this sentiment of a woman and the relationship is actually when Odysseus washes up amongst the Phaeacians and encounters Nausicaa for the first time in Book 6. And when Odysseus meets Nausicaa, he offers her a benediction. He says, upon meeting her, he says, compassion, I'm reading from the Fagel's translation. This is book 6, line 198. Odysseus says, compassion, princess, please. You, after all that I have suffered, you are the first I've come to. I know no one else, none in your city, no one in your land. Show me the way to town. Give me a rag for cover, just some cloth, some wrapper you carried with you here. And may the good gods give you all that your heart desires, husband and house and lasting harmony too. No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts that work as one, despair to their enemies, a joy to their friends, their own best claim to glory. That ain't Antony and Cleopatra either. Continuing in the epic trilogy, we come across yet another thing that I think Antony and Cleopatra are not, this time from Virgil in the Aeneid, which is actually even referenced in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And as you may recall, Aeneas is dallying with Dido, and not getting on with the foreordained business of founding Rome. And this is the Fitzgerald translation of the Aeneid. And in Book 4, starting at line 259, Virgil writes, in those days rumor took an evil joy at filling countrysides with whispers, gossip of what was done and never done, how this Aeneas landed, Trojan-born, how Dido in her beauty graced his company, and then how they reveled all winter long, unmindful of the realm, prisoners of lust. These tales the scabrous goddess put about on men's lips everywhere. Her twisting course took her to King Iarbas, whom she set ablaze with anger piled on top of anger, son of Jupiter Hammon by a nymph, a ravished Garmentean. This prince had built the god 100 giant shrines. It goes on. And now they send a message, is sent to Aeneas. Is via Mercury, which says, the command is given to Mercury, "Sun, bestir yourself, call up the zephyrs, take to your wings and glide, approach the Dardan captain where he tarries, wrapped in Tyrian Carthage, losing sight of future towns the fates ordain. Correct him, carry my speech to him on the running winds. No son like this did his enchanting mother promise to us, nor such did she deliver, twice from peril at the hands of the Greeks. He was to be the ruler of Italy, potential empire, armorer of war, to father men from Teucer's noble blood, and bring the whole world under law's dominion. If glories to be won by deeds like these cannot arouse him, if he will not strive for his own honor, does he begrudge his son, Ascanius, the high strongholds of Rome? What has he in mind? What hope to make him stay amid a hostile race and lose from view Ausonian progeny, Lavinian lands? The man should sail. That is the whole point. Let this be what you tell him, as from me." And Mercury does indeed deliver the message, and Aeneas takes up the message and goes. This too is not Antony or Cleopatra. Two more before I pass on to what it is. One is I would just like, since we've been mentioning Romeo and Juliet, and because Romeo and Juliet is obviously a Shakespearean play, and there is a love element to it, I would just like to read briefly from the opening scene and from the final scene, just to remind you how I think Shakespeare is presenting this particular love story. The prologue to Romeo and Juliet has a chorus and says, "Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which, but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend." Excuse me. And this is picked up in the very final scene, where the prince says in Act 5, Scene 3, 291, "Capulet, Montague, see what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love, and I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen, all are punished." So one of the things in Romeo and Juliet is that it is indeed a tragedy in the kind of traditional sense, that it's a shame. It would be better had it not happened, and it's not even their fault because it's the feuding, the unreasonable feuding of the Montagues and the Capulets that have brought it about. And once again, this is not the story of Antony and Cleopatra. So, what is the story of Antony and Cleopatra? And I'd like to turn then by trying to offer a first approximation of an analogy I was trying to come up with a word. Everybody's been using the word apotheosis or apotheosize. But I'm trying to think of the opposite, like de-apotheosize. I don't know what that word would be, but if anybody knows it, I'd be... yes, right, devolute, but the de-deification, as it were. And in this particular case, that it is, in a sense, that Antony and Cleopatra, as Shakespeare presented to us, is the de-apotheosization of Mars and Venus. Okay? And to kind of set the scene for this, I'd like to do one more reading outside of Antony and Cleopatra, also from the Odyssey. This is from Book 8, starting at line 302. And I'm going to read, it's a little bit long, but I think it's important to kind of have this in mind as we are going through Antony and Cleopatra. And it's when Odysseus is with the Phaeacians and the bard Demodocus is singing. And he sings this song about the love of Ares and Aphrodite, who are the Greek equivalents of Mars and Venus. And the song goes like this. The love of Ares and Aphrodite crowned with flowers, how the two had first made love in Hephaestus' mansion, all in secret. Ares had showered her with gifts and showered Hephaestus' marriage bed with shame. But a messenger ran to tell the god of fire, Helios, lord of the sun, who spied the couple, lost in each other's arms and making love. Hephaestus, hearing the heart-wounding story, bustled toward his forge, brooding on his revenge, planted the huge anvil on its block and beat out chains, not to be slipped or broken, all to pin the lovers on the spot. This snare the fire god forged, ablaze with his rage at war, then limped to the room where the bed of love stood firm, and round the posts he poured the chains in a sweeping net, with streams of others flowing down from the roof beam, gossamer fine as spider webs no man could see, not even a blissful god. The smith had forged a masterwork of guile. Once he'd spun the cunning trap around his bed, he feigned a trip to the well-built town of Lemnos, dearest to him by far of all the towns on earth. But the god of battle kept no blind man's watch. As soon as he saw the master craftsman leave, he plied his golden reins and arrived at once and entered the famous god of fire's mansion, chafing with lust for Aphrodite, crowned with flowers. She'd just returned from her father's palace, mighty Zeus, and now she sat in her rooms as Ares strode right in and grasped her hand with a warm, seductive urging. Quick, my darling, come, let's go to bed and lose ourselves in love. Your husband's away. By now he must be off in the wilds of Lemnos, consorting with his raucous Sintian friends. And her heart raced with joy to sleep with war, and off they went to bed and down they lay. And down around them came those cunning chains of the crafty god of fire, showering down now, till the couple could not move a limb or lift a finger. Then they knew at last there was no way out, not now. But now the glorious crippled smith was drawing near. He turned around miles short of the Lemnos coast. For the sun god kept his watch and told Hephaestus all. So he rushed back to his house, his heart consumed with anguish. Halting there at the gates, seized with the savage rage, he howled a terrible cry, imploring all the gods, Father Zeus, look here, the rest of you happy gods who live forever. Here is a sight to make you laugh, revolt you too. Just because I am crippled, Zeus's daughters Aphrodite will always spurn me and love that devastating Ares. Just because of his stunning looks and racer's legs, while I am a weakling, lame from birth. And who's to blame? Both my parents, who else? If only they'd never bred me. Just look at the two lovers, crawled inside my bed, locked in each other's arms. The sight makes me burn. But I doubt they'll want to lie that way much longer, not a moment more, mad as they are for each other. No, soon they'll tire of bedding down together, but then my cunning chains will bind them fast, till our father pays my bride gifts back in full. All I handed him for that shameless bitch, his daughter. Irresistible beauty, all unbridled too. So Hephaestus wailed as the gods came crowding up to his bronze-floored house. Poseidon, god of the earthquake, came, and Hermes came, the running god of luck, and the archer Lord Apollo, while modesty kept each goddess to her mansion. The immortals, givers of all good things, stood at the gates, and uncontrollable laughter burst from the happy gods when they saw the god of fire's subtle, cunning work. One would glance at his neighbor, laughing out, A bad day for adultery. Slow outstrips the swift. Look how limping Hephaestus conquers fire, the quickest of all the gods who rule Olympus. The cripple wins by craft. The adulterer, he will pay the price. So the gods would banter among themselves, but Lord Apollo goaded Hermes on. Tell me, Quicksilver, giver of all good things, even with those unwieldy shackles wrapped around you, how would you like to bed the golden Aphrodite? Oh, Apollo, if only, the giant killer cried. Archer, bind me down with triple those endless chains. Let all you gods look on, and all you goddesses too. How I'd love to bed that golden Aphrodite. A peal of laughter broke from the deathless ones, but not Poseidon, not a smile from him. He kept on begging the famous smith to loose the god of war, pleading, his words flying, let him go. I guarantee you Ares will pay the price. Whatever you ask, Hephaestus, whatever's right in the eyes of all the gods. But the famous crippled smith appealed in turn. God of the earthquake, please don't urge me on this. A pledge for a worthless man is a pledge indeed. What if he slips out of his chains, his debts as well? How could I shackle you while all the gods look on? But the god of earthquakes reassured the smith. Look, Hephaestus, if Ares scuttles off and away, squirming out of his debt, I'll pay the fine myself. And the famous crippled smith complied at last. Now there's an offer I really can't refuse. With all his force, the god of fire loosed the chains, and the two lovers, free of the bonds that overwhelmed them so, sprang up and away at once, and the war god sped to Thrace, while love, with her telltale laughter, sped to Paphos' cypress isle, where her grove and scented altar stand. There the Graces bathed and anointed her with oil, ambrosial oil, the bloom that clings to the gods who never die, and swathed her round in gowns to stop the heart, an ecstasy of vision. Now, that story, I think, is a starting place for us to consider Antony and Cleopatra. And it really sets up, this is the story, if we put it into Roman terms, of a love affair between Mars and Venus. Okay? But in this case, they are actual gods. They are immortal. Nothing really tragic can come to them because they are immortal. What Shakespeare, I think, is presenting us, and it's presented in the very first scene that Antony is identified explicitly with Mars, and that Cleopatra implicitly is with love. I mean, her fourth word out of her mouth is love in the play, and that she is identified with Venus. That, in a sense, in Shakespeare's hands, Antony and Cleopatra have become as close to the god Mars and the god Venus that it is possible to come while still being mortal. And the difference between mortality and immortality makes all the difference. Okay? So that there is a very real sense, I think, in which what we're meant to see in this play is that Antony is mortal Mars. He is the quintessence of man, the paragon of man, the ne plus ultra of man. And likewise, Cleopatra is the mortal Venus, the quintessence of woman, the maximal woman, the paragon, I don't mean in virtue, but the most woman that you can get. And it made me think, to have this, that really, I mean, they're not kidding.
Vectors!
No, not vectors. No, this story is the story of mortal Mars and Venus, of man and woman in their maximal mortal expression. The difference between the real Mars and Antony is the one of immortality, and between Cleopatra and the Venus is the one of immortality. And that they express in a particular understanding, not necessarily the Greek understanding now. Now we come back to Shakespeare's time. His understanding of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And this brings us to the Antony and Cleopatra as they are depicted in this particular play. And since we've talked a lot about these various issues and these various quotations, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I would like to just kind of summarize what I see as some of the major issues in this regard. That Antony is being presented as, I mean, this is part of the difference between what we're being told about these characters or what we know about these characters from before the play opens versus what we are actually shown during the course of the play. So this Mars, this mortal Mars, who was, you know, pure man before he had encountered Cleopatra, has in fact become fettered. He is doting. This is what the triple pillar of the world, transformed into a strumpet's fool, is about. Antony knows it. Everybody around him knows it. And Antony's trying as hard as he can to get out of it, but ultimately he can't. He can't. And this play on Antony's emasculation by Cleopatra, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's something about this woman that is taking this man down. And with Cleopatra, I think it's fair to say that in Shakespeare's conception of her as, again, I don't mean a moral paragon, but as the most womanly of women, that she, again, represents a kind of consistent portrayal of the feminine, that she's egocentric, she's sensual, she has the, I don't say desire, but certainly the ability to emasculate, to some degree, Antony, that she plays the role of a man, that in fact, and now this is where we're going to start coming to what I would like to begin to using some biblical imagery, that Cleopatra is actually consistently referred to as the serpent of the Nile. That she is described as cunning, past man's thought. Okay? And that Antony says that, and Enobarbus says in reply, no, her passions are made of nothing but the finest part of pure love. And here we're back to the point, I don't want to be forced in the position of having to take any single character's quote as right or wrong. Cleopatra is being presented to us as readers or as an audience, as cunning, and lovely's not the right word, but, you know, Venus in this sense. And Antony is being presented to us as a man who is torn between two conflicting desires that he cannot reconcile. He is, in fact, again, to use biblical language, a house divided against itself. No man can serve two masters, cannot serve what his duty requires, or what it requires for him to be one of the triple pillars of the world, and to serve his desire to be in love or lust or whatever it may be, as a private person with this woman, who, as I believe it's Enobarbus, who says, is clearly one of the wonders of the world. Like if you happened to be in the neighborhood and didn't buy a ticket to go see her, you would be wasting your trip to that corner of the world. Okay? I mean, she really is. She's a sight to behold. And yet, when this Uber woman comes in contact with this Uber man, he can't control the result. And his inability to control the result ultimately brings them down. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Well, what I'd like to point out as we move to here is that in some real sense, Antony and Cleopatra are a matched set in this play. There really is, you know, Cleopatra's had other men. She's had Julius Caesar, Pompey, and so on. But I think in this play it appears that really no other man is appropriate or suitable for Cleopatra other than Antony. And that as we're shown, whether you agree with it or like it or not, that really Antony doesn't find any other woman equal or appropriate to him. That in some sense, they are natural spouses who nonetheless destroy themselves. Okay? And the kind of the emblem of this, the mascot of this destruction, I think really is the Battle of Actium, which is described in Act 3, Scene 7. And I won't read the whole thing because we've talked about it at some length, but what I'd like to point out is that in Act 3, Scene 7, there are kind of three three separate but related complaints about the way Actium is going to be conducted. Number one, Enobarbus, the soldier, everybody, they should not be fighting at sea. Antony's military genius is at land, and the old Antony, who was the greatest general, the god of war, or the mortal Mars, should have known that. Okay? Second of all, Cleopatra should not have been present. Okay, because, as is pointed out, she is a distraction on every level to Antony. But Cleopatra insists on being present because she says, like a man, because she is in fact, I'm going to do my part, okay, just like all the other leaders, but she is actually stepping out of the role of being a woman into the role of being a man, and it's going to cause trouble. And it may be that these, again, if we go back to the poetic nature of the text, you know, some of these things are not completely explained, like why does Antony want to fight at sea? I mean, maybe he's just taking up a dare because he's that kind of guy. But you'd like to think that the mortal Mars, the great general, was more than a guy just running around accepting dares all over the Middle East. Okay? But it appears that because Cleopatra actually has 60 ships, she has a navy, then it may well be implied that Antony is choosing to fight the way in which Cleopatra can participate. So it can be you and me, babe, against the world. Okay? Which, mistake. And the third mistake at the Battle of Actium is, you know, the most obvious in a way, is that the general, the mortal Mars, had no business turning tail and flying after Cleopatra herself has turned tail. That, as I think it's Enobarbus says, we are led by women. Where have all the men gone? Wasn't it like a song in the 60s? Where have all the generals gone? Right. Okay. And that in a sense, when we put all of these pieces together, we're given a play, and I'm going to kind of try to condense, you know, from the whole play now. And I know I'm asking you to take quite a bit on faith, but we've talked about a lot of these things, and I'll be happy to discuss them later. Is that Antony suffers a tragic, piteous, pathetic downfall, that the man who was once the quintessence of man, the mortal Mars, there is no man more manly than he, the man who has lived by the sword, cannot even die by the sword. That comedy, it's pathetic what has actually happened to him, that he's become so inept. And on the flip side, Cleopatra is obviously destroyed too in the sense of dying, but it's not exactly symmetrical. I think the image that I've come up with this, and it goes along with the serpent image, and also with the asp, and which is described as a worm, and also her sexuality, is that really Cleopatra, the serpent of the Nile, the quintessence of woman, the mortal Venus, the woman who has lived by the worm, so to speak, has in fact died by the worm. Okay? That these two have come to this pass. And that in a sense, in the play, Cleopatra has ruined Antony, who in turn has ruined himself and her. And if we go to the very beginning of the play, Act 1, Scene 1, where Philo says, "Nay, but this dotage of our generals o'erflows the measure. Those his goodly eyes that o'er the files and musters of the war have glowed like plated Mars, now bend, now turn, the office and devotion of their view upon a tawny front, his great captain's heart, which in the scuffles of great fights hath burst the buckles on his breast, reneges all temper, and is become the bellows and the fan to cool a gypsy's lust. Look, where they come, take but good note, and you shall see in him the triple pillar of the world transformed into a strumpet's fool. Behold and see." And at the very end of the play, in Act 5, Scene 2, Caesar says of them when they are dead, at 5:2, 3:59. No grave upon the earth shall clip in it a pair so famous. High events as these strike those that make them, and their story is no less in pity than his glory which brought them to be lamented. Okay? So again, I'm not taking it out that Caesar as a character or a Philo as a character is somehow privileged to represent the truth of the matter, but that they are part of, when I use Bakhtin's term, of a consistent voicing of a theme within that's represented in many ways throughout the play, that Antony has let himself be beguiled. The most manly man has allowed himself to be beguiled by the most womanly woman, or couldn't help himself, or however you want to understand that. And it's here now that I'd like to make a shift. Because I'd now like to kind of like, let's talk. This is a story that may begin to be sounding familiar to people. This idea of a quintessence of man is not very far from the notion that one might think of as primordial man. And that the quintessence of woman is not that far from primordial woman. And if we go to the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 1, now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God say that you are not to eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the evening breeze, and you know the kind of how this story goes. God's come looking for them. They hide. Adam, what have you done? She made me do it. She said, what did you do? The snake made me do it. Okay. And at verse 14, the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. Skipping to the woman, he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and in toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life, etc., etc., etc. The man named his wife Eve because she's the mother of all living, and God made the first set of clothes for them. The thing I want to point out about this is not just the snake and the temptation, but one of the morals of the story in Genesis, whether you like it or agree with it is a different thing, okay, is that the problem is that the man listened to his wife. That's the problem. And as part, they're both punished with this, and henceforth, she is to be ruled by him, and he is not, if he is not a complete putz, not to listen to her. Okay? And in a very important sense, this is what happens in the story of the mortal Mars and the mortal Venus. And this, I'm going to transition now to a couple of other pieces. This is, in a sense, the close of what I call the tragic feature of Antony and Cleopatra, in a sense, that this mortal Mars, beguiled by this mortal Venus and not listening to himself, but being tempted by her, has caused his own destruction and as a consequence her destruction. And as we've talked about in several of the passages, it's not just the destruction of those two individuals, I think. That in some sense, when Antony and Cleopatra, the play, comes to an end, that there is a sense that we are coming to the end of a certain way of life, that a certain world is coming to a close, a certain era is coming to a close. And I mentioned this the other day in terms of, for those of you who are familiar with Beowulf, for example, or akin to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which takes place a little bit later, or if we want to put it back in biblical terms, the end of the world of the Old Testament in some ways. But part of the tragedy or the closure or the destruction, I think, that's occurring in Antony and Cleopatra, the play, is the end of a world and of a way of life. And it's the fall of man. Now, this is going to take me to the next way, I think, of looking at Antony and Cleopatra as a comedy, because there, in the prior section where I was looking for a tragedy and trying to come up with the opposite of apotheosization, de-apotheosization, here we can just use the normal tongue twister, because the comedy, I think, is the apotheosization, deification of Antony, which occurs in the 5th act. And I think that this makes Antony and Cleopatra kind of a comedy in at least two senses. I mean, one of the things which is, I think, find most funny is that it's funny in Act 5. Like, this clown comes in, and they get all of this kind of like joking around. It doesn't seem like situationally appropriate with Cleopatra. But then the other sense of comedy is that we're getting something that, in fact, perhaps also has a happy ending. Okay, and that doesn't mean humorous, but in a happy ending. Because it turns out that, from one perspective, an ending is also a beginning. That the ending of one era and epoch is often associated with the beginning of a new era or epoch. Or the closing or ending of one story, for example, the Old Testament, is associated with the opening or beginning of a new story, the New Testament. And that this fall of man, the most men of men and woman of woman, in a sense, the greatest love story that the pagan world was capable of, and which in fact led to their destruction and to the demise of the pagan world, simultaneously is setting the scene for a much greater and truly the greatest love story the world has ever known. That there is the beginning of a place for Antony 2.0. And in defense of this, I'm going to go through a number of pieces here, and this is the part that I'm still working this out. So I hope you will bear with me. But I want a couple of places to talk about this. One is, as we discussed, all of these I think have been discussed, or most of them have been discussed previously. One is the very beginning in Antony Cleopatra, Act 1, Scene 1, 17, which is this line from Revelations 21:1, talking about the opening of a new heaven and a new earth. And I think, for those of you who are not familiar with your Christian Bible, I mean, the book of Revelation is the final book in the New Testament. It's really both bringing to a close the New Testament, the Bible as a whole, and looking forward to some future messianism. But the New Testament itself is also bringing to a close the world of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. So there's that. But the place which is I found really quite striking, and we heard last night, is in Act 5, Scene 2, line 75, where Cleopatra goes on, "I dreamt there was an Emperor Antony. Oh, such another sleep that I might see, but such another man. His face was as the heavens, and therein stuck a sun and moon, which kept their course and lighted the little, the earth. His legs bestrid the ocean, his reared arm crested the world, his voice was property as all the tuned spheres, and to friends, but when he meant to quail and shake the orb he was as rattling thunder. For his bounty there was no winter in it, and autumn 'twas that grew the more the reaping. His delights were dolphin-like, they showed his back above, the elements they lived in. In his livery walked crowns and coronets. Realms and islands were as plates dropped from his pockets. Dolabella says, Cleopatra, think you there was or might be such a man as I dreamt of? Cleopatra says that. Dolabella says, gentle madam, no. Cleopatra says, you lie. Up to the hearing of the gods. But if there be or never were such one, if there be nor ever were such one, it's past the size of dreaming. Wait, did I skip? Yes, past it. Nature wants stuff to vie strange forms with fancy, yet to imagine as Anthony were nature's pieced against fancy, condemning shadows quite. And there is, did I skip? Yes, okay. So the one that I want to go back to is where she says, in his livery walked crowns and crownets, realms and islands as plates dropped from his pocket. Okay? That there's this picture of this enormous Anthony 2.0, as it were, who will be King of Kings and bestride the world. And in the book of Revelation, at 19:11, the author writes, Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his heads are many diadems, and he has a name that has inscribed that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So the suggestion which I'm coming here, and this is where nobody whose ideas I'm appropriating may wish to be associated with this, is that I actually think that there is an implicit allusion to Jesus with Antony. That the greatest love story that the pagan world was ever capable of producing and brought to an end, man 1.0, Adam and Eve, is going to be replaced by the new Adam and the new world. And if we go back to the book of Luke, chapter 2, this is, Joe, for better or worse. Luke chapter 2 says, In those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus to all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. So Augustus's census is what's getting them to Bethlehem in this gospel. Okay, it's different than Matthew, for example. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them to stay. It turns out, in the same Gospel of Luke, which I only discovered yesterday, and again, I don't want to make more out of this, but I also don't want to make less. In Luke chapter 24, which is the final chapter of Luke, there is an event, starting at verse 13, about two of the disciples. This is following the resurrection, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Now on the same day, the two of them were going down to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, What are you discussing with each other while you walk along? They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered. The name Cleopas is a short form for Cleopatros, which is the male version of the name Cleopatra, the glory of the Father. Now, again, I'm just doing this as a poetic thing, that it turns out that one of the characters' names in Antony and Cleopatra appears in the Gospel of Luke in association with Jesus. Okay? So, what I would like, and if you start looking at the structure, I mean, we can do lots of other things, and I'm running out of time, and I'm sure people are going to want to have questions and so on. So I'm going to try to be brief about this. But even if you look at the structure of the play, the fact that Antony is dead for the whole fifth act, okay, there is not only there strong associations, I think, with, for example, the book of Revelation, bringing things to a conclusion and a new heaven and new earth, or if you want to do it in Old Testamental terms, with the book of Malachi, which is the last book of the Old Testament, which is understood as predicting the coming of Jesus. And it's important to understand that in traditional terms, Jesus is understood as the second Adam. Adam 2.0, who his love, and the love that Jesus is going to bring into the world is a completely different kind of love than this. And presumably will have not have the same tragic ending that the Adam and Eve style love, or the mortal Mars and the mortal Venus have as an ending. Because if you go back to our story in Genesis, at the end of the Eden story, starting at verse 22, after God has made them clothes, the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. That, in a sense, what's one way of understanding the Garden of Eden story is that, first of all, it's the semi-apotheosization of Adam, but the one thing left is eternal life, which is what Jesus, etc., is going to bring into the world. And that, in a sense, all of this stuff that we're kind of being given a la Beowulf or something else, a classical equivalent, in a way, of the Old Testament. Okay? And we might conclude this part of my remarks, or I'll conclude this part of my remarks, as we read in Matthew 2:15. "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son." All right, so I'm going to try and tie this whole mess together, and then I will invite your barbs and arrows.
And then you will tell us your title.
Yes, I will tell you the title. I think my hypothesis is that it boils down to this. European culture is conventionally considered to be the fusion of two cultural ancestors, the classical or Greco-Roman and the Hebraic or Judeo-Christian. And I think the play that Shakespeare has produced, Antony and Cleopatra, is an example of such a fusion, although I have no idea whether Shakespeare did it intentionally or was even conscious. I mean, I don't know. But nonetheless, what we have is something which is overtly and explicitly classical, for which you can read pagan. It's overtly about the Romans, but that it is in fact covertly or implicitly Hebraic, for which we might read Christian. And that it is at once both tragedy and comedy, in the same way that the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is both tragedy and comedy. The greatest love story that the pagan world with pagan values was capable of, the end of an era that nonetheless paved the way for a new and better era, thus simultaneously prologue and foreshadowing to the truly greatest love story that God or the Christian world is capable of. And I have other quotations which I've been going through here, which I won't bother to do now, but from the book of Malachi or from Revelation and so on. But the bottom line is this. In technical terms, what I think Shakespeare has done is provided us with what could be called a Christological Antony and Cleopatra. The word Christological is a term which is used about to reading Christ into various sources where not normally or was not originally considered to appear. This usually is first and foremost with the Old Testament, where the standard Christian Christological reading of the Old Testament, even though Jesus is never mentioned, never appears anywhere in the Old Testament, is understood to be everywhere, in the shadows, hiding behind every rock, because it's all leading up to Jesus. And so that's one famous example. In the classical world, one other famous example of a Christological reading is of Virgil's Fourth Eclogue, which is traditionally understood to be a pagan instance prophesying the birth of the Messiah. Okay, and I actually have the text here and some interesting things in here. There's a mention of Egypt and so on and so on. And that what Shakespeare has done is that he has in fact silently Christologized Plutarch and made the story of Antony and Cleopatra psychologically and theologically, but somehow mysteriously resonant and relevant at some kind of archetypal level for a Christian audience. And as my final last piece of evidence, and the thing that I'm most hesitant to do, I'm actually going to call as evidence for the plausibility, not to say the truth, of this thesis, Mr. Bevington himself. And I want to say I have the greatest respect for Mr. Bevington as a scholar and as a man, and nothing I'm saying now should be taken as a criticism in any way. But Mr. Bevington is human like all of us and is liable to the occasional mistake. And I confirmed with him the other night, actually, that there is in fact a small mistake in one of the footnotes that he has to Plutarch if you have this Bantam volume of Antony Cleopatra. It's on page 293, footnote 65. And I'm not quibbling with it, but I think the nature of the mistake is actually diagnostic of the issue that I'm raising here. Because in the mention of Plutarch itself, starting in the middle of the page, Plutarch says, for he said, talking about Antony, he sent Fonteius Capito to bring Cleopatra into Syria, unto whom, to welcome her, he gave no trifling things. But unto that he added the provinces of Phoenicia, those of nethermost Syria, the Isle of Cyprus, a great part of Cilicia, that country of Jewry where the true balm is, and that part of Arabia where the Nabateans do dwell, which stretcheth out towards the ocean. And in footnote 65, it says that this balm, i.e., where Christ was crucified and resurrected. And I raised the question that because Plutarch, to my knowledge, was not Christian or would not have been thinking in terms of balm in Christ, and Mr. Bevington acknowledges much and that it was a mistake. But I think it's a diagnostic mistake. And I don't want to, you tell us yourself, but I suspect that actually what happened is that being steeped in the play, these things were resonating around at some level, and it came out in this error. And that the error itself is not random, but diagnostic of the point that I'm trying to make, and which I think could actually be fleshed out in some other way. So I will conclude here the new title for my remarks, such as it is, with a nod also to T.S. Eliot, is to make an end of love is to make a beginning of love. The Christological Antony and Cleopatra. Thank you.